Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is that okay? Thank you very much. I'm told that a good speech always starts off with a joke, so I think I'll do that. A BBC interviewer once asked a philosopher of education, what makes a good curriculum? And his answer was, that's an interesting question. It depends on what you mean by curriculum. It also depends on what you mean by good. It also depends on what you mean by makes. And come to think of it, the question mark is deeply problematic as well. I'm going to do something similar to the title of this center that chef that has been cooked up, which I'm sure will result in lots and lots of delicious outcomes. Center for Higher Education Futures. The notion of center is an interesting notion. What does it do? What makes a center a center? This is a question that I think those who are associated with this center will have to grapple with. Why center? Why not an institute? Why not a school? Why not a university? What does center signify? That is an interesting question. The question of for is interesting as well, because why not of rather than for? In other words, there is already a practical orientation built into the notion of for, that we are going to do it for somebody. The center is designed to be of service to something rather than of, simply for its own edification. The notion of education, of course, is also interesting and has been debated forever, and I don't think I need to say anything more about that. That will continue to happen. What kind of education is appropriate in the contemporary era, and how is education to be reconfigured to align itself with the futures that have been imagined and that have been thought about. The notion of futures also raises interesting questions. How do we know that what future is it that we are aspiring for? Who does the aspiring of the future? When do we know that we have arrived at the future that we envisage? How do we predict the future? How do people think about the future and then align their behaviors around those? And indeed, normatively, what futures are good futures as opposed to bad futures, or indeed any futures? But I think I want to actually also ask a question about higher. What makes education higher? Is it simply that it's for 19-plus-year-old students? Or is there something other that is signified by the notion of higher? Okay. Is higher notion simply that refers to something chronological? Or does it refer also to something qualitative and indeed normative? Okay. Higher in what terms? For whom it is higher? Okay. And then if there is a notion of higher, then there must be a notion of lower as well. What is lower education as opposed to higher education? Now, these are difficult conceptual issues, and I think I could go on, but I hope you've got enough of a sense to realize what I'm getting at. I'm getting at that we are living in an era in which these ideas that had reasonably settled meanings are no longer so settled, okay? And that we are at a stage when we are having to rethink these ideas in relation to a whole range of logics, in commercial logic, the moral logic, the political logic, the technical logics. These logics are raising these concepts to become essentially contested. And it's the work of that understanding of those contestations that I believe would be one of the main purposes of the center. The center will have to actually figure out what it means to think about higher education as higher education rather than some other. And how is the lower levels of education relating to higher levels of education? And that's something that I want to talk about. What is happening in schools is important in relation to the debates, the arguments, the analysis that we have of higher education. In other words, what's happening in schools is not irrelevant for us to think about higher education. Because higher education are places, locations, where students already prepared in schools come from. And as a result, they come with expectations. They already have certain views of the futures that higher educations are supposed to be serving. Okay? In other words, we receive our students on the first day of the orientation, students who have already constructed for themselves a view of the future. And we are serving those people the futures that have already been made. And in many ways, we are remaking those futures for them. We are getting them to think about those futures in ways that are slightly different than is the case that might have been happening. In other words, we have to enter schools as higher educational researchers to figure out what is happening in schools and what kind of students and what kind of aspirations and what kind of ideas and what kind of views, imaginaries of the futures that they are coming to us with. Okay? And how is it that what we do depends on the extent to which we can engage with their sense of future in relation to developing our sense of future. In other words, the futures that we all have to be somehow reconciled, because quite often they are incredibly competing. There are conflicts that emerge as a result of different people having different views of futures. In South Africa, where I have been recently, is something really very interesting happening. The democratic government of Mandela and all the other governments had promised students a higher education future. The students came with a future in mind. That future has failed to be delivered. And as a result, there are a whole range of problems that have emerged because the universities have not understood the futures that are encapsulated in the views of the students that they teach. To understand the students, we need to focus on the notion of futurity. Future is becoming an increasingly important concept. And as a result, we are now living in an era in which temporality and its logic and its questions that arise around issues of time becomes important. How does the past, that is the secondary school, shapes the present, the experiences of the present, and how does the future in turn shapes the current as to what it is that we find satisfying and what we don't. These are complex philosophical questions, I admit, but I think these questions are important questions that we must examine and think about. I have been thinking about these issues very seriously in relation to the research that I've done with a number of colleagues that some of you here know about on elite schools in 7 different countries. These countries include Australia, India, Singapore, Hong Kong, Barbados, South Africa, and United Kingdom. We are looking at the ways in which schools that were established in the 19th century during the high colonial period of the British Empire now are engaging and interpreting the processes and the forces of globalization. Okay? How is it that they are making their future that was constructed in the high logic of colonialism and then was thought about in the logic of post-coloniality now has to be interpreted in terms of the neoliberal globalization? How are they remaking themselves is an issue that we are looking at. And the work that we have done will be out in a book called Class Choreography, to be launched next week, indeed. But I think what we found in these schools that was incredibly interesting was in starting from year 8 and sometimes even earlier in primary school, many of the students have higher education futures as absolutely a central part of the ways in which they engage with their secondary education. In other words, their experiences of secondary education are framed often by the assumptions that they make about the requirements of higher education. Okay? They are constantly talking about higher education. And of course, in a context of internationalization, They're thinking about education not only within the national locality, but in the transnational space. So for example, I came across a student, and this would interest Miguel. We came across a student who had become an expert on ranking data that he consumed as a hobby. He was constantly reading up the websites of Time Higher Education and of the Shanghai Index and all those things. And he was the go-to person for other students who wanted to find out as to which university was ranked when. So I would say to him, Purdue University in Indiana, and he would sort of say, oh, 105. That was the number of the ranking. He knew these things. Just as when I was a child, I remembered cricket scores and cricket averages. Okay? Exactly the same way. And this guy. Now, I am absolutely fascinated by this kid. This kid, although he was in a very elite schools, had actually come from a relatively modest mean. The chances of him getting to an elite or indeed any higher education abroad was almost negligible. And yet his desire, his hope, his aspirations were so tied to this logic of international higher education that was dominating him, so much so that he was often spending more time learning the dreaded Times Higher Educational pages rather than doing his homework or doing his maths home. Now, there is something that needs to be understood about aspirations and about the cultural logic of emotions that are created around issues of higher education at the secondary education level. Now, secondary schools are changing and changing rapidly in the context of internationalization to cater for this kind of demand, and in the process creating a certain kind of supply as well. The relation between supply and demand is becoming incredibly complicated and incredibly interesting. For example, they're developing a whole range of strategies focused on student mobilities. The elite schools that we went to, there wasn't a single student we found who had not been outside their country. That's the kind of world that we are looking at. So when we offer student mobility programs, we often assume a tabula rasa. That's not so. The schools have already prepared students with experiences of mobility. They have already been prepared with a logic of, with their aspirations of global citizenship of a certain kind. They've already been prepared for certain things in relation to the ways in which the world is becoming globally interconnected. These issues are quite central to the ways in which schools now operate, especially at elite schools, where the possibility of the students, the graduates, going abroad has become very high indeed. Let me give you a figure of the school in India that I worked in. When I first went to the school in 2011, only 7% of the students went abroad for higher education. Only 7%. Okay? This year, I am told by the principal, 43% of the students went there. And by 2020, they're expecting 60% of the graduates from this school in central India to go abroad. Now, what does that tell me? A, it tells me something about India and the middle class in India, which has now got the consumer power that they previously didn't have. The second thing that is happening is that the school is becoming part of a globally integrated space rather than a national space. We are part of a globally integrated space of education in which higher education and secondary education are absolutely tied to each other, almost like twins. Okay? Of course you can separate them, but the ways in which we often ignore what is going on in secondary education, in higher education studies, in my mind is fundamentally mistaken, because what is happening in an integrated space, in which these distinctions are becoming arbitrary. And indeed, we will probably see the development of institutions where this division between higher education and secondary education is not going to be recognized as we might actually get seamless. I work at the University of Illinois for part of my year every year. And at the University of Illinois, they are now, State Board of Education is now thinking not of P to 12, that is preschool to 12, but P to 16 as the formulation for defining the integrated educational system. Largely because the assumption that secondary schools were one thing and higher education is another is breaking down in the minds of some policymakers. And P to 16 model is becoming much more common. Many of the students at the schools that we went to go on study tours and go on model United Nations things. They go to conferences and they do a whole range of things. The other thing that is happening in internationalizing, especially the elite schools, is the development of a whole range of new global programs like International Baccalaureate or a revised version of Cambridge International Examinations. These are becoming incredibly popular. According to the president of the Indian International Schools Association, there is one international school created every week in India. Every week. One school every week. 50 or so schools are created international. These international schools are quite often determined in order to provide and in order to encourage the students to imagine the space of possibilities, the space of their global, their higher education futures to be global rather than local. The students who are coming to us in Australia, in Denmark, in England, in the United States, are coming with this particular worldview already entrenched in their heads. Okay? They are not novices about globalization. They are not novices about the rhetorics of global citizenships. They are not novices about global mobility. They are well and truly prepared, according to a friend of mine called Zlato Skribic. This is everyday and organic and ordinary cosmopolitanism that is becoming indebted. The trouble, of course, is that it is becoming defined, this integrated space, largely in commercial and business terms. So in other words, the cosmopolitanism that we are now developing, especially in these elite schools, with all the differentiation that it implies between elite and non-elite, those people who are left behind and those people who get the crowning glory. What this implies is really something very interesting, is that they're moving and they're being prepared, and their imagination is being constructed around a very business and market-orientated aspirations about higher education. In other words, the ordinary and everyday organic cosmopolitanism is the one that is designed for the frequently traveled, as articulated by Craig Calhoun, the social theorist. Or indeed, it is the corporate or corporatized cosmopolitanism that is being encouraged in this new system. In other words, futures are being talked about. Futures are ubiquitous. Futures are absolutely central to the understanding. But how and why and in which direction? That's the question. In other words, we begin with the assumption that futures are already here. Okay? But then try to interrogate it. Try to understand how it is that they might be shaping us and shaping our institutions in various ways. And then, of course, the hardest questions of them. How do we work with the ordinary and everyday corporatized, business-oriented cosmopolitanism towards a culturally and morally productive one? That's an ethical question. That is a question that we need to ask. instead of buying into the cosmopolitanism, generated quite often at the school level, and the aspirations that kids are asked to develop. Okay, how at university level we work to steer, to enable the students to understand the forces by which they are becoming shaped and their cosmopolitan experience is being shaped. And then sort of saying, having understood it, how do we move them towards another kind of future, a more democratic, more egalitarian, more fulfilling, more ethical futures. So futures is a very interesting term. And I think there is a huge amount of conceptual work that needs to be done around futurity, as my friend Jacob has already begun to do. But I think for higher education, we are in the business of future making. We are in the business of defining futures. We are in the business of determining futures. Futures are not inevitable, okay? Futures have to be made. But futures are already being made. They're being made in a certain way, in schools and in general community and in the kind of forces that Geeta talked about, okay? The question becomes, how do we then steer what the futures that are already being made to the futures that might be of a different kind and a different modality and of a different way of creating human existence and social formations of various kind. Thank you.